Following up on the Pinto's gas tank mishap, GM, not one to be outdone by Ford, had to blow the Pinto's flaw out of the water. Pun intended. This defect would claim the lives of over 2,000 people. Let's get started into this shit show. The Sidesaddle fuel tank design was installed in over 10 million trucks, including all 1973 to 87 GM full-size trucks. It is the worst auto crash fire defect in the history of the U.S. Department of Transportation. Yes, even worse than the Pinto. Based on data from the Fatality Analysis Reporting System, over 2,000 people were killed in fire crashes involving these trucks from 1973 through 2009. This is 20 times more than the quote, death trap Ford Pinto. But how did this happen in the first place? Well, GM management wanted to install 40-gallon capacity gas tanks for better driving range and use this as a selling point, which, great idea, right? The easiest way to do this, install two 20-gallon fuel tanks outside the frame rail where they were more vulnerable to rupture and puncture by sharp objects and crashes. In 1972, GM engineers recommended to the Vice President for Engineering that if occupants were not killed by crash forces, they, quote, should be free from the hazards of post-collision fuel fires. This did not happen. GM engineers recommended that shields to be installed around the tanks to protect them, but management didn't listen because, engineers don't know anything. But the consequences would rear its ugly head. GM knew it was bad enough to run a special accident study comparing the 1973 model trucks to the pre-73 models, which showed that the 1973 trucks had more fuel leaks than the pre-1973. I wonder why. There were alternative designs brought to the table, like moving the tanks inside the frame or installing a plastic liner around the tank. Crash tests of 22 GM pickups in 1981 to 1983 to develop protective designs revealed that the tanks, quote, split like melons. Well, why didn't GM act on anything though? Money. With a couple of simple calculations, GM engineer Edward Ivy estimated that these fiery deaths were costing GM about only $2 per vehicle, the implication being that it was not enough to justify the expense of changing the vehicle's design, because GM doesn't give a fuck about their customers. Finally, in 1992, the Center for Auto Safety and Public Citizen filed a recall petition with the NHTSA detailing serious fire hazards to owners of the 1973 to 1987 GM pickups. Yeah, it only took them 15 years. GM responded to the NHTSA inquiry with a 55-page letter and 80 boxes of documents that they argued proved the fuel tank was no danger because, of course they would. Do you think that Ivy memo was in there? It wasn't, because that had to be swept under the rug. On April 9, 1993, the NHTSA called on GM to voluntarily recall all of its 6 million 1973 to 1987 full-size CK pickups with side-saddle fuel tanks. In its official response to the NHTSA's recall request, GM refused to comply with the government's voluntary recall and instead submitted a 50-page study supporting the safety of its trucks. Wow, back then AI wasn't writing their damn defense letter, was it? But money talks in this country, because on November 17th, GM filed a lawsuit in the Federal District Court in Detroit, whose primary purpose was to open the back door to the Justice Department for negotiations to scuttle the investigation. The case was General Motor Corp. versus Pena. Also, the Justice Department attorney assigned to the case owned $4,000 of GM stock at the time. More important than owning the GM stock was the fact that the Justice Attorney had worked on defending Ford defects while in private practice, like the Pinto, and knew that this position taken by a GM would benefit Ford in defense of future cases. On December 2, 1994, GM and the DOT settled the case without a recall, and with GM agreeing to fund $51.35 million in safety programs. But this was all just a slap on the wrist, because this deal was kinda shady in a couple ways. One, the deal purported to commit GM to spending $51 million on various alternative safety programs to save hundreds of lives, but no documentation has ever been provided. GM did not even have to put up cash, but was allowed to put up equivalent facilities, staff, and salaries. Also, GM was free to spend the money where it wanted. So, if GM wanted to give public education money to the American Coalition for Traffic Safety, which lobbied to stop the CK recall, it could do so. In addition, the deal was the very first defect settlement in which no remedy was offered to the owners of the defective vehicle. So, Good luck surviving a crash, I guess? But in time, GM did get hit with lawsuits. In the end, a 1996 class action lawsuit over these fuel tanks was settled for a total of $5 billion. Data updated through 2009 from the NHTSA's Fatality Analysis Reporting System show that over 2,000 people have been killed in the fire crashes in the US with these trucks. So even though GM paid out hefty sums over the controversy, no dollar amount takes away the pain of the loss of a loved one from the families of these victims. And unfortunately, I'm not sure if I can spin this positively in any way to finish this video, but as always, stay hydrated, take care of yourself and your loved ones, and peace.